My name is Serena Calloway, and I need you to understand something before I tell you this story. I was not born with claws. I had to grow them. I had to sharpen them on the bones of every person who told me my daughter didn't count, that she wasn't enough, that she was the wrong kind of heir simply because she came out of me without the one thing the Del Vecchio family had worshipped for 4 generations, a last name they could pass down through a son. I was 31 years old, standing in the marble foyer of a 10,000 square foot estate in Buckhead, Atlanta, holding my newborn daughter wrapped in a pink hospital blanket, when my mother-in-law, Rosaria Del Vecchio, looked at that baby and said, and I will never, not once in my life, forget this, she's lovely, but she's useless to us. That was the day I stopped being naive. That was the day Serena Calloway started building something the Del Vecchios never saw coming. Let me back up. I met Nico Del Vecchio at a real estate conference in Miami when I was 26. I was a junior architect at a boutique firm downtown, presenting renderings for a mixed-use development in Wynwood. He walked up to me after my presentation with the kind of confidence that only comes from never being told no. Jaw square, suit tailored within an inch of its life, smile like he already owned the room and was just deciding whether to let you rent a corner. That northeast elevation is wrong, he said. I turned around. Excuse me? The window to facade ratio on the northeast side. It'll kill the interior light in winter. Whoever your solar consultant was, fire them. I stared at him for a full 3 seconds. Then I said, I am my solar consultant. He blinked. Then he laughed, not a condescending laugh, a surprised one, like he genuinely hadn't expected that. Nico Del Vecchio, he said. I know who you are, I said. And I did. The Del Vecchios were Atlanta real estate royalty going back to the 70s, when Nico's grandfather, Sal, had turned a single strip mall in Decatur into a portfolio worth north of $800 million. By the time I met Nico, the family controlled commercial properties across Georgia, Tennessee, and the Carolinas, with a hand in hospitality and private equity that nobody outside of certain circles talked about out loud. I should have walked away. I didn't. We dated for 2 years. I won't pretend it wasn't good, because it was. Nico was brilliant and magnetic, and occasionally capable of genuine tenderness. Those late nights in his midtown penthouse when he'd pour bourbon and talk about architecture like it was sacred, like building things was the closest a person could get to God. I fell for the version of him that showed up in those moments. I married a man who mostly kept that version locked away and only let it out when he needed something from me. The wedding was at the estate in Buckhead. His estate, 250 guests, a dress that cost more than my first car, and a rehearsal dinner where Rosaria Del Vecchio made a toast that was ostensibly about welcoming me to the family, but was actually a 45-second reminder of the Del Vecchio legacy and what it required. She looked at me when she said legacy. She looked at my stomach when she said continuation. I was not yet pregnant, but I understood the assignment. I got pregnant 14 months into the marriage. Nico was cautiously excited. His father, Enzo Del Vecchio, a thick-necked, silver-haired man who had the energy of someone who'd made hard decisions for decades and felt fine about all of them, shook Nico's hand at Sunday dinner like the baby was already born and already male. Nobody asked me how I felt. I was incubating an heir. That was the role. When we found out it was a girl, I was 22 weeks along. The doctor said it warmly, the way good doctors do. Congratulations, it's a girl. And I cried because I was happy. I was genuinely happy. I'd been secretly hoping for a daughter since the day I found out I was pregnant. Nico went very still. On the drive home, he said, "We'll try again after." I said, "After what?" He didn't answer. I said, "How long?" He said, "Serena, I picked up my daughter from the bassinet by the window. I had brought her with me. Nobody had told me not to, and now I understood why nobody had said a word. And I walked out of that dining room. I walked through the foyer. I walked past the portrait of Salvatore Del Vecchio on the wall. the one where he looks like he built the world with his bare hands and expects gratitude for it. I walked out the front door and into the October evening, and I sat on the front steps of a $10 million house with my daughter on my lap, and I said to her, quietly, "They just made the biggest mistake of their lives." She grabbed my finger. She held on. Let me tell you what happened in the next 6 months, because this is where people always get it wrong when they tell stories like mine. They assume the woman cried. They assume the woman begged. They assume she spent nights in her childhood bedroom eating ice cream and questioning her choices. I did none of those things. I got a lawyer. Not a divorce lawyer, not yet. A forensic accountant with a law degree named Patricia Voss, who came recommended by a woman I'd met at a design conference in Charleston 2 years earlier. Patricia had the energy of someone who had spent decades watching wealthy men assume their paperwork was airtight and had made an excellent living proving them wrong. I called her on a Tuesday. By Thursday, we had our first meeting. By the following Monday, she had identified something in the Del Vecchio trust structure that the family's attorneys had apparently never thought to look at too carefully, because why would they? Nobody was looking. The trust had been built for a world where women were peripheral, wives, mothers, decorative, and peripheral things don't need to be defended against because peripheral things don't come for you. I was done being peripheral. Here is what I had. My name was on the operating agreement for 3 of the Del Vecchio commercial properties, specifically a mixed-use development in Midtown Atlanta, a hotel property in Charlotte, and a retail corridor in Nashville, because Nico had needed a co-signer 4 years earlier when a deal went sideways and his personal credit was temporarily compromised due to a private judgment that the family had very quietly settled. He had asked me to co-sign as his wife, a formality, nothing major. Nothing major. Patricia looked at those agreements and said, "You have operational equity interest in these 3 properties." I said, "What does that mean?" She said, "It means you're not just a wife, you're a partner," and they forgot. I sat very still for a moment. Then I said, "Good." I filed for divorce 13 months after Della was born, on a Wednesday morning in November, while Nico was in Charlotte for a development meeting. I had already moved out, quietly, over the course of 6 weeks, taking only what was mine and Della's and nothing that could be disputed, and installed myself in a rental house in Virginia Highland, 3 bedrooms, good schools nearby, a backyard Della could grow up in. The Del Vecchios expected a settlement negotiation. They expected their lawyers to sit across from mine and offer me a number and watch me take it and sign the papers and disappear back into the world I'd come from. Instead, Patricia filed a claim asserting my equity interest in all 3 properties. And then things got interesting. Enzo Del Vecchio called me personally. This was remarkable because in 4 years of marriage, he had spoken to me directly maybe a dozen times, and most of those were at formal dinners where it was unavoidable. He said, "Serena, let's be reasonable." I said, "I've always been reasonable, Enzo. That was my problem." He said, "You don't want to do this." I said, "I really do." There was a long pause. Then he said, "You'll lose." I said, "Okay," and hung up. I need to tell you about Nico now, because Nico is not simply a villain in this story. Nico is something more pathetic than a villain, which is a man who knew something was wrong and chose to stay comfortable instead of standing up. He knew what his family was doing to Della. He knew what that trust restructuring meant, that his daughter was being categorized as less than before she could walk, less than before she could talk, less than before she had the chance to be anything at all. He knew, and he sat at that table, and he looked at the wood grain, and he did not say a word. That is not dramatic evil. That is the kind of small, corrosive cowardice that does more damage over time than any single act of cruelty, because it teaches your daughter that the person who was supposed to protect her chose not to. It teaches her that her value was always conditional. That lesson, if I let it land, would follow Della for the rest of her life. I was not going to let it land. Here is something people don't know about family real estate empires. They are almost always more fragile than they look. They look like fortresses from the outside, the estates, the portfolios, the lawyers, the legacy. But inside, they are paper constructed over decades of relationships and handshake deals and assumptions that nobody ever challenged. Challenge one assumption, pull one thread, and the whole thing starts to breathe differently. The Charlotte hotel property was the thread. Patricia had found, buried in the operating agreements in language that Nico had clearly signed without reading carefully because he trusted his family's lawyers to protect his interests, which, of course, they were protecting, just not his, a clause that gave co-signing operational partners the right to trigger a buyout at fair market value if the property missed its projected net operating income targets for 2 consecutive years. The Charlotte Hotel had missed its targets for 2 consecutive years. It had been missing them quietly, the losses absorbed into the broader portfolio, because the family had a practice of redistributing income across their entities in ways that kept individual properties looking fine on paper, while the actual numbers told a different story. Patricia knew what she was looking at. She'd been looking at things like this for 20 years. We triggered the buyout clause. The number was $11 million. That is what the Charlotte Hotel was worth at fair market value, and that is what the Delvecchios owed me as co-signing operational partner under the terms of the agreement Nico had signed 4 years earlier. They paid it. They had no choice. Their own lawyers confirmed they had no choice. Enzo paid it with the energy of a man biting through a piece of glass, and I imagine that is exactly what it felt like, and I will not pretend I felt sorry for him. I took that $11 million and I did something with it that the Delvecchios would not understand for another 2 years. I bought land. The land was in West Midwit, Atlanta, 6 acres, industrial zoning, the kind of neighborhood that was still 2 or 3 years behind the curve, but had all the bones of somewhere that was about to become something. I had been watching that corridor for 3 years. I knew the rezoning applications that were quietly moving through city planning. I knew the restaurant groups that were having early conversations about the area. I knew what was coming because I was an architect, because I had been trained to see buildings before they existed, and now I was going to use that skill for myself instead of for a family that had decided my daughter was a footnote. I hired a small team, a contractor I'd worked with for years named Dale Brewster, who had the kind of institutional knowledge about Atlanta construction that you cannot buy or manufacture, a real estate attorney named Kwame Osei, who had grown up in the city and understood its neighborhoods the way you only can when they're part of your personal history, and Tanya Rivers, who had spent 8 years at a luxury hospitality group and left to go independent because she was tired of making other people look good. And Patricia, always Patricia, watching the numbers. I named the development company Della & Co., just to be clear about what I was doing and who I was doing it for. The Delvecchios heard about the land purchase through their contacts at City Hall. They had contacts everywhere. That was part of how they operated. And Enzo apparently laughed. Someone who was in the room told me this later. He laughed and said something about how Serena was going to learn an expensive lesson. I kept building. Here is what I need to tell you about Della during these years, because she is the center of this story, even when she's not on the page. She was extraordinary. She walked at 10 months. She was talking in sentences at 18. She had her father's dark eyes and used them the way I used blueprints, with intense, quiet focus, taking in everything, deciding what mattered. She started at a Montessori school in Virginia Highland at age 3, and on her second day, she came home and told me one of the other kids had said that girls couldn't be builders. I sat down on the kitchen floor with her. We did this, sat on the kitchen floor when things were important, eye level, no furniture between us. And I said, "What did you say back?" She said, "I said my mom builds things and she's a girl." I said, "That's right." She thought about it for a second. Then she said, "Can I come see what you're building?" I said, baby, when it's done, I'm going to give it to you. The West Midtown development took 3 years from land acquisition to opening. I am going to tell you what we built because it matters. A mixed-use property with 14,000 square feet of retail on the ground floor, 62 residential units above, ranging from studios to 3 bedrooms, a rooftop event space with a view of the Atlanta skyline that I designed personally, and, on the corner, with its own entrance and its own identity, a boutique hotel with 44 rooms, a restaurant helmed by a James Beard semifinalist, and a bar that became, within 6 months of opening, one of the most written about spaces in the city. We called the hotel Della House. The design pulled from Atlanta's industrial heritage: exposed concrete, warm wood, original brick where we could preserve it, and layered in materials and light that were unmistakably feminine without being soft. Hard things made beautiful. That was the brief I gave myself. Hard things made beautiful, built to last. The total development cost was just over $40 million. By the end of year 2, the portfolio was valued at $93 million. Now I need to tell you about the affair. I found out about it 2 years after the divorce was finalized, which means it had been going on during the marriage, during the pregnancy, during the year after Della was born, during all of it. A woman named Brianna Holstead, whose family had social connections to the Delvecchios going back 15 years. She was not a secret, I learned. Not really. Within certain circles, certain Atlanta circles where the old money families orbited each other at charity galas and private club dinners, people had known for years. People had looked at me at those events with a kind of careful pity I had mistaken for the standard condescension of the very wealthy toward the merely successful. It wasn't condescension, it was guilt. I found out through a woman named Claudette, who had been a friend of Rosaria's for 30 years and had apparently developed in the back half of those years a bone-deep contempt for how the Delvecchios treated the women who married into them. She called me at my office one morning, introduced herself, and told me everything in about 12 minutes in the calm, precise tone of a woman delivering a report she had prepared carefully. I thanked her. I hung up. I sat at my desk for a long time. Then I called Tanya and told her to push back our 11 o'clock by an hour, and I walked to the little coffee shop on the ground floor of our building, and I sat in the window and I watched West Midtown move around me, the construction crews and the delivery trucks and the early lunch crowd and a woman with a stroller navigating the sidewalk outside Della House, and I thought about what to do with what I now knew. I decided to do nothing, for a while. Sometimes the most powerful move is patience. Nico remarried. Brianna Holstead became Brianna Delvecchio at a ceremony at the Buckhead Estate in late October, 2 years after our divorce was finalized. I know this because Della was not invited. My daughter, Nico's daughter, a Delvecchio by blood and name, was not invited to her own father's wedding. He called me the week before to tell me, not to apologize, to inform me, in a voice that suggested he had practiced the call, that it would be easier for everyone if Della wasn't part of the day. I said, "Easier for who, Nico?" He said her name, Brianna. He said Brianna felt it would be complicated. I said, "Della is 6 years old." He said, "I know. I'm sorry." I said, "No, you're not. You're sorry it's awkward for you. That is not the same thing." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Serena, I do love her." And the thing is, I believe he did, in whatever limited way he was capable of. I believe Nico Delvecchio loved his daughter the way some men love things they've already decided don't belong to them, at a distance, with a kind of clean, uncomplicated sadness that costs them nothing. I said, "Then act like it," and I hung up. I went into Della's room and she was on the floor with her Legos building something with absolute concentration, and I sat down beside her and said,
"What are you making?" She said, "A tower with a hotel in it." I said, "Tell me about it." She talked for 45 minutes. I didn't think about Nico again that day. The moment of reckoning, and there is always a moment in stories like this, where the pieces come together and you get to watch the people who thought they were untouchable realize they were standing in a house of cards the whole time, happened at a commercial real estate summit in Atlanta in the spring. The Delvecchios attended every year. They had for decades. It was the kind of event where the city's real estate establishment gathered to do the particular dance of networking that is really just power confirming itself to power, everyone circling to see who had grown and who had shrunk since last time. I attended for the first time that year. I was on the keynote panel, not as a wife, not as an adjunct to anyone else's story, as a developer whose West Midtown project had won 3 industry awards, whose portfolio had expanded to 4 Atlanta properties, plus a new acquisition in Nashville, whose company, Della & Co., had been profiled the previous month in Atlanta magazine under the headline, "The Architect Who Built Her Own Empire." Della was in the front row. She was 7. She wore a navy dress, and her hair was in 2 braids, and she had her father's eyes, and she sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched the stage with the same focused quiet she brought to everything. I looked at her once at the beginning, before I started talking. She gave me a thumbs up. Enzo Del Vecchio was in the audience. Rosario was not. She had developed health problems in the past year, I'd heard, the kind that come from decades of controlling a world you can feel slipping. But Enzo was there, in his usual seat near the back, with 2 of Nico's cousins and their respective lawyers. I presented for 22 minutes on mixed-use urban development, the changing demographics of Atlanta's growth corridors, and the economic case for building residential and hospitality product that reflected the city's actual population rather than a mid-century fantasy of who that population was. I talked about Della House specifically. I put up images of the building, the interiors, the rooftop at night with the skyline behind it. I talked about what it meant to build something for your daughter. I did not mention the Delvecchios by name. I didn't need to. Anyone in that room who knew the history, and many of them did, understood exactly what they were listening to. After the session, Enzo found me in the reception area. He looked older, not diminished. Men like Enzo don't fully diminish, but older in the way of someone who had encountered resistance they hadn't accounted for in their original calculations. He said, "You've done well." I said, "I know." He said, "Della & Co. We know what that means." I said, "Good." He said, "You could have just taken the settlement, Serena." I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about the foyer. I thought about Rosaria's voice. I thought about Nico looking at the table. I thought about Della on the delivery room scale, 7 pounds, 4 ounces, entirely perfect, already not enough for these people. I said, "Enzo, a settlement would have been for me. This is for her." He started to say something. I said, "She's going to run a better company than your family ever did, and she's going to do it with her name on the door. And one day, when someone tells her she's not enough, she is going to look at what I built for her, and she is going to know, in her bones, not just her head, that that's a lie. That's what this was for. Not to beat you, to make sure she never believed you." He had nothing to say to that. I picked up my drink. I walked back to my daughter. 3 months later, Nico called. He asked if he could be more present in Della's life. I said that was up to Della. Della, at 7 years old, said she would think about it. She thought about it for 2 weeks. Then she said yes, he could come to her school play. He came. He sat 2 rows behind me. He cried during the part where the kids sang. After, Della ran past me first. She always runs to me first, and then circled back to him and said, "Did you like it?" He said, "You were the best one up there." She said, "I know," very matter-of-factly, because I had raised her to know. Della & Co. acquired its 8th property last year. Nashville, Charlotte, 3 in Atlanta, one in Birmingham, one in Chattanooga, and a boutique resort development outside Asheville that the architecture press has already started writing about before a single wall is up. Patricia Voss is now on the board. Tanya Rivers is our chief marketing officer. Dale Brewster runs construction operations. Kwame Osei is general counsel. I built the team I wanted because I had the money to build it and the vision to know what I needed, and nobody could tell me otherwise because I was the one who put the capital in and the one who knows where every wall goes. Here is what I want to tell you about revenge, because I know that's part of why you're still reading. Real revenge, the kind that lasts, the kind that actually satisfies something deep and true in you, is not about destruction. It's not about watching the people who hurt you lose. It's better than that. It's about becoming so completely, so undeniably, so permanently the thing they said you couldn't be, that their original opinion of you becomes laughable, becomes a relic, becomes something you pull out occasionally and hold up to the light and think, can you believe they actually thought this? Rosaria Del Vecchio called me 2 years ago. She had a stroke. She was recovering, doing physical therapy, and something in that process had apparently cracked something open in her, because she called me from a rehab facility in Buckhead, and she said, "I want to see Della." I said, "Della is who that decision belongs to." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Will you ask her?" I asked Della. Della said, "Why does she want to see me?" I said, "I think she's trying to figure out if she did something wrong." Della thought about this with her characteristic seriousness. Then she said, "Okay, but I want to bring my portfolio." I said, "Your portfolio?" She said, "Of the buildings. I want to show her what we're working on." She was 9.